Someday, on some magical, wonderful day in the future, we are going to realize that banning things doesn't work. Someday. But today is not that day. Today is the day when we read yet another headline about how criminals are walking around with loaded guns inside secure venues in gun free Australia. And instead of the media recognizing the obvious truth that our gun laws are a failure and we need to change direction, they instead insist that we need to double down, to go even harder on the thing that's not working. The trouble is that our gun laws are actually worse than ineffective. They are a danger to our personal safety and to our national security, and anyone who is pointing to Australian gun laws as some sort of gun control success story needs to get their facts straight. My name's Topher Field, this is the Topher Project, and I help busy people like yourself to make sense of the world as it changes around you. But how do you make sense of people insisting that we need to double or triple down on our gun laws when they are so clearly not working in the first place? This latest story is just one of many, but it is pretty funny because it captures so many aspects of this issue. These were illegal guns, in other words, unregistered. They were presumably handguns because they were concealed in the pants of the two men involved. These men were out on bail, so already presumably criminals, and they were inside the Melbourne Cricket Ground, an iconic and globally recognised sporting venue with pretty decent security. Yeah, criminals with guns inside a secure location in gun-free Australia. Tell me again how well gun laws are working in Australia. The thing is, here in Australia, we can't keep weapons and drugs out of maximum security prisons. So, in what universe do we think we're going to be able to keep weapons out of our country? And clearly we can't, because in addition to the 4 million registered guns in Australia, we also have an estimated 1 million unregistered illegal firearms, most of which were imported illegally on purpose. Yes, there are some left over which were never handed in when the gun laws changed in 1996, and yes, there are some which were legal guns but were then stolen and are now on the black market. But the majority of the 1 million illegal guns in this country were imported for the purpose of serving the demand of the black market. By definition, these are guns for criminals. Now, stories like this one aren't actually all that rare. In fact, a few years ago, just one metropolitan region of Melbourne reported that they were finding multiple illegal guns per week, roughly one every 2 days, just on the criminals stupid enough to get caught. Can you imagine how many people were walking around with guns and not getting caught in order for one to be caught every couple of days just in that part of Melbourne? If you spend an afternoon out on the town in Australia, I guarantee you will have walked past multiple people with illegal guns and had absolutely no idea. We have a million illegal guns in the hands of criminals in this country right now, and yet, for the most recent year with data, 2023, just 27 people were murdered with a gun. I made a video about the million illegal guns recently, so I'm not going to recap all of that, except to say that clearly Australians do not lack the hardware with which to shoot each other. We just choose not to do it, except amongst hardened criminal gangs fighting turf wars over the illegal tobacco trade, which is another example of complete regulatory failure. But I've covered all of that already. What I want to focus on today is that not only have our gun laws not stopped criminals from having all the guns that their hearts desire, but because they have disarmed law-abiding people and made us defenseless in our own homes, we are now seeing people being killed because of a lack of guns, including criminals being killed because their victims didn't have guns. Yes, you heard me correctly. People are being killed for two main reasons, one personal, the other geopolitical. We'll start with the personal. There's a saying that when guns are outlawed, only outlaws will have guns, and that's true, as this story here illustrates, but there is another layer to it. If you disarm the law-abiding potential victims of crime, the criminals no longer need guns and they become extremely bold. Have you seen some of the headlines coming out of Melbourne recently? People walking down the streets with machetes threatening people, people being stabbed to death in public places, people waking up terrified as home invaders threaten them with bats and blades to take their keys and steal their cars. When you make the victims defenseless, the criminals don't become less violent. They become more bold and more violent with other weapons that are perfectly easy for them to get their hands on. This clearly hurts the victims of those crimes, obviously, but in combination with weak bail laws, which put these violent criminals back on the street usually within hours of their arrest, this is also devastating and deadly for the criminals. Now, most of these criminals, well, they're young men who just needed a good ass whipping in their childhood. They needed to be given something greater than themselves that was worth living for. But they didn't get either of those things. So they end up as teenagers and they end up killing themselves and others in high speed car chases. Now, that doesn't usually happen the first time they commit a violent crime. No, it takes time for them to build up to that. They have to have already got away with it a few times, been arrested and released a few times, and through that process, we actually breed people with contempt for the property and welfare of others and no respect for human life, not for their own, and certainly not for anyone else's. This is how you get fatalities of the innocent and the guilty alike. And just last week, or earlier this week, sorry, I made a video about two teenagers who wrote themselves off on a tree. Two more killed, not by guns, but by a lack of guns. Let me explain. What if these petty criminals, what if these young aspiring thugs knew that inside every home was a loaded shotgun and a homeowner willing and able to use it? How would that affect their decision making? How would that change their incentives? You see, the gun grabbing fearmongers would have us believe that they would simply go charging in with guns of their own and start shootouts and there'd be blood knee deep running down the streets. But that's not what has happened anywhere in the world that has encouraged law abiding people to own firearms for self defense. What usually happens is that, well, some criminals give up the criminal lifestyle entirely, but many don't. But the ones that don't, they move away from crimes that involve the risk of confrontation. They move away from home invasions, and they move towards crimes where the victims are not present at the time of the crime. Things like smash and grabs and breaking in when they think the house is empty, rather than what they're doing right now, which is deliberately breaking in when they know the homeowners are there because they want to get the car keys. Knowing that the victims are armed changes your calculus as a criminal completely. Even if you're armed yourself, your risk of getting hurt just went up massively. And even dumb criminals know what the sound of a pump action shotgun means. Now, you may object that you don't want criminals getting shot. These are just young, dumb teenagers who need some guidance. They don't deserve to die. Okay, but they're already dying, and they're sometimes taking other people with them. None of these idiot teenagers learned a damn thing from the news that two of their idiot mates had written themselves off on a tree. They all think they're immune. Young, dumb, testosterone fueled males, they think they're immune from that they have superior skill behind the wheel, and that things like that wouldn't happen to them. But if those same two kids had been shot whilst stealing the car in the first place, it sends a very different message. The end result for the two criminals is the same: game over. The message to their idiot mates is very different. Most of these criminals out there are doing these crimes because they lacked any real consequences in their childhood. They didn't have a parent who loved them enough to discipline them, to punish them when they went astray, and to hold them to a higher standard. Take that childhood and add the fact that they still don't face consequences because of our soft bail laws and our catch and release justice system, and what do you get? Where you get kids out on bail for the 20th time, stealing cars and driving recklessly, madly, at incredibly high speeds, risking everyone's lives in the process. You get kids with machete fights in public places and killing each other. I'll say what we're not allowed to say in this country. Some of these kids need to get shot. Now, I don't want them to die, but I'd rather risk them dying from buckshot than dying in a high-speed collision with an innocent bystander. Proverbs 21:11 says, "When a mocker is punished, the simple gain wisdom." These people are mocking our laws and our justice and our peace. And when they get punished, those around them will learn a valuable lesson. I'd modernize that a little bit and say when a violent criminal fool gets shot in the face, his mates have an opportunity to make some better decisions for themselves. Yes, I know, snowflakes will be outraged. How could you say that? These kids are already dying because they're of your faux compassion. They're dying because we disarmed the victims and removed these fools from experiencing any consequences, so their criminality and their violence escalates. That's how our lack of guns is killing people at a personal level. But it's going to be so much worse at a geopolitical level. Follow me on this. Australia is not just a disarmed population. We are a disarmed nation from a military perspective, too. Our military is tiny. You can count the number of operational submarines at any moment in time on one hand, and our entire frontline infantry forces would be considered a rounding error in the monthly casualty count of the Ukraine war. Thankfully, our geography makes us difficult to attack, and thank God for that, because we are not in a position to defend ourselves if we are attacked. But before you say, well, we need to spend billions more on the military, let's just take a realistic look at our situation and our options. We are a rich country in per capita terms globally, notwithstanding the current cost of living crisis. If you just take a global look, Australia is per capita still very, very wealthy. But we have a tiny population for a massive landmass. So we would have to spend record amounts of GDP on defense year after year just to see a modest bump in our capabilities. And in any case, our defense force is having trouble hitting its recruiting targets. So even if we spend the money, it's not a given that we'll get the personnel. It would require a huge amount of spending for really very little gain to build our military up to a meaningful level. And if war doesn't come, then we're maintaining that level of spending indefinitely for what? We don't have to do it that way. There's an apocryphal quote that's attributed to Isoroku Yamamoto. Now, in truth, he probably never quite said this way, but he probably expressed a similar sentiment, but not in exactly this way. The supposed quote is, "You cannot invade the mainland United States. There would be a rifle behind every blade of grass." And whilst the quote itself is probably just an amalgamation of his sentiment rather than a word-for-word quote, the sentiment is exactly correct. And this thinking also factored into the calculations for the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Should it come to an actual ground war on the soil of the United States of America, the size of the American military is a secondary consideration to the simply terrifying prospect of having to face off with the American rednecks. And if you doubt that serious military planners would take such things into account, look no further than Afghanistan, where goat herders, as they were mockingly called, successfully defeated the Soviet Union in the 1980s during the height of their power, and then defeated the United States more recently during the height of American power. Now, the Taliban, the very people that the US went there to destroy, run that country. They defeated the Russians using small amounts of American equipment and training from the CIA. Then they defeated the Americans using Russian surplus equipment left over when the Russians withdrew. That's all it took, was the will and some rusty AK-47s. The will and the capability of the general population to engage in combat, or at least in low-grade insurgency, is a critical consideration from a geopolitical perspective. And sadly, the vast majority of Australians would be as combat effective as Teletubbies. Most Australians don't just lack any concept of gun handling and safety and accuracy. Most Australians are actively afraid of guns. I've done some shooting in my time, not heaps, but some. And I went to an indoor gun range to shoot handguns for the first time in my life. And I watched in awe as a fully grown woman in my group had a full-on meltdown just from touching the handguns. Tears, sobbing, shaking, an uncontrollable, visceral fear and loathing driven not by any bad experiences that she'd ever had in her life, but by the assumptions and prejudices that she held because of the news and the television. The reason she was there is because she was studying to be an actress, and she had decided that she needed to do some shooting so that she could audition for roles that involved handling guns, which, yeah, that's a sensible decision for an actor or an actress because guns show up a lot in TV. Needless to say, after that meltdown from just touching a handgun, her acting career has been less than stellar. We don't need to spend a fortune on our military to have some special separate group of people that are trained and equipped to do our fighting for us. That makes no sense in Australia. No matter how much we spend on them or how many people we recruit, it will never be enough for the scale of the continent that we have to defend with a population that is so small. Instead, let's change our laws and attitudes towards guns. Guns for home and self-defense, but also guns for sport and recreation, for hunting, for pest control, and yes, for shooting bad guys should the worst come to the worst. There's plenty of Australians who would happily fund their own collection of guns, their own range time, their own training and safety, etc., if our laws were changed to be more permissive and less onerous. And if the government stopped treating shooting as some kind of a vulgar, almost evil pastime, and recognised instead that a nation full of shooters will not only have fewer violent criminals, but will also provide a greater deterrent value against our adversaries. This can be done quickly. It's just a change of some laws. It can be done fast and with no cost to the taxpayer whatsoever. But to do that would require our politicians to abandon this obviously idiotic fantasy idea that Australia has succeeded in gun control and that we're somehow safer because of it. And that would require our politicians to admit that they were wrong. Which is why, whilst it certainly should happen, and it makes way more sense than what we're doing right now, sadly don't hold your breath. My name's Topher Field. This is the Topher Project, and I help good people like you to make sense of the nonsense in the world around us. I am 100% viewer supported, so if this has made sense to you, then you'll love my book, Good People Break Bad Laws. It's about civil disobedience in the modern age. And if you're a Christian, or if you're interested in what the Bible has to say about civil disobedience, you need to read Good Christians Break Bad Laws. Plus, you can get my t-shirts, my hoodies, DVDs, and more from goodpeoplebreakbadlaws.com. Thanks for watching all the way to the end. I really appreciate it. Please like, comment, subscribe, and YouTube thinks that you would enjoy this video, so why not check it out? I'll see you in the next one. And as always, stay free.